Now, human development, as you all know, is about development psychology, growth, change across the lifespan. So it used to be called developmental psychology, but then they figured the better term is lifespan development. So lifespan development is a scientific study of the courses of growth, change, and stability. The important word here is the fact that it says scientific, which means that you don't make things just based out of observation. You are not judging everybody's growth rate by the same lens that you see the world in and your own culture. So it's very important to sort of have statistical basis for a lot of stuff on lifespan. Um, it's also about growth, which means it's a linear upward movement. It's about change, which can work in any way, right? And it's about stability, meaning that even if there is change, there is a certain plateauing of certain kinds of behavior or attitude or thoughts or maturity or whatever, right? Across the lifespan. So from birth to death, right? Lifespan development is covering all of it. It's a interdisciplinary concept, obviously, because so many different things are involved in it. The key issues are nature versus nurture, which is the debate saying that how much of lifespan development is genetically and biologically determined versus how much of it is learned while existing in a social setup. Now, there are a lot of debates about different concepts within nature versus nurture in terms of language, intelligence, etc., etc., right? Maturity, physical growth, cognitive growth. But today we are at a point where we know that both nature and nurture are equally important, right? Then you have stability versus change, which is again for how long, which time period in the developmental journey is stable, and at which point change takes place, how much of that is biological, how much is not biological. So one of the interesting things is the idea of puberty, right? Every human being, most at least 99% of human beings will go through puberty, um, which is a biologically determined fact, right? But you can speed it up or sort of slow it down, right? And that's more nurture induced. And after that change, there is a certain level of like there's an upheaval of change, and then there's a certain stability that comes into your life once you cross like 18, 19, right? In terms of your body. So that's an interesting thing that exists. Change may be quantitative or qualitative, meaning that there might be change in terms of height, weight. These are all quantitative. Qualitative is in terms of, say, maturity, moral development, that sort of thing. Then there's continuity, discontinuity, meaning that there are certain things that will continue, right? Certain things will stop at certain ages. So, for example, if you're an athlete, you can't possibly be playing at the same level when you're 40 compared to when you're 20, right? Because there is a discontinuation in the physical prowess and just reaction times. Then we have the discussion about critical and sensitive periods. Critical periods, initially, they used to think that it was more about specific time periods where if something didn't happen, then that would affect the person for a lifetime. So Freud's theory of psychosexual development was that where he said that if there is fixation, then that affects the adult personality forever. However, now we've realized that everything is not so deterministic, everything is not so causatory in nature, but there are sensitive periods which affect the human behavior. So, getting puberty at a certain age is very important, right? Um, your sensitive period in terms of moral development, very important, intelligence, very important. So, all of these things are now in the basic ideas in terms of what we are negotiating. Uh, Imprinting was an idea that was more critical is an idea that's actually more about critical period, which is basically where for young geese, right, they form an attachment with the first moving object and they follow it around. So as soon as they're born, when they see something moving, that's the first thing that they will imprint themselves on, and they will follow it around like it's the mother, because evolutionarily it's supposed to think of the first thing that the child sees when they're born is the mother, right? And then it's supposed to follow it around. So that's a biologically determined trait that's there. So I think this was Lawrence who's found this, and then um, it's automatic, it's irreversible. But this is for geese, right? For human behavior, there are no critical periods. There is nothing fixed. Things can always sort of change. So we no longer look at critical periods. We think of sensitive periods, right? So those feral children that you all must have heard about, children who've not had appropriate social contact at a young age, generally their language development, cognitive development, all of those social development will not take place when they get older, which is a problem, right? And then they are referred to as wild children because they don't ever learn proper human behavior. But then we've also seen that for a certain period, if they are taught, they might learn a few things, right? So it's that debate between critical and sensitive periods. Uh, then within developmental psychology, you study physical development, cognitive development, psychosocial development, moral development. There are different stages of development. So prenatal is from conception to birth. Infancy is from birth to 3 years, sometimes considered as 2 years. Early childhood is between 2.5 to 6 years. Middle childhood is 6 to 12. Adolescence is anytime you hit puberty and beyond till the age of 20. Then you have young adulthood, or what is called as emerging adulthood now, between 20 and 40. Middle adulthood 40 and 65. Later adulthood 65 till you die. And within each of these, there are different stages again, right? But these are the larger periods of development that exist in the lifespan space. When we study developmental psychology, we are taking few principles which are important, right? We are saying that development is lifelong, saying that you're till you're alive, there is some form of change, growth, development that's taking place. So it's continuing, it never stops. Um, it involves both gains and losses, meaning that there are some skills you'll develop as you get older, and there are some skills you'll lose also, right? It's multi-directional, meaning that it moves in different directions for different things, right? So it's not just one like cognitive and that's it. It's cognitive, it's physical, it's moral, all forms of development, and it's all moving at the different paces, right? Yeah, then development is considered to be plastic, meaning that it can change whenever it's modifiable, like the neuron. It's also always affected by the historical and cultural context one finds themselves in. So, for example, somebody who was born during the World War, for them, their lifespan development is very different compared to someone who's born in the 21st century, right? You all must have noticed this in your own lives where you see younger people than you using their phones differently, behaving differently compared to how you were at that age. So it's always impacted by the kind of context you find yourself in. Uh, in today's terms, for somebody who's growing up because of the pandemic inside a household for 2 years now almost, right? For them, their social development naturally will be slightly different compared to other people who grew up at a different time period, right? Um, there will always be individual differences also, right? Because individual differences are determined by hereditary, which is your genetics. It's also affected by the environment. So everyone has a different family, different relatives, different cultural context, different caste, creed, religion, and all of these things affect us, right? And everyone has separate experiences also, depending on the kind of city, the place, all of these things. So there are going to be individual differences in lifespan development. So when we do the scientific study, what we are trying to do is we're trying to find patterns that fit almost all human beings. But you might notice that for some people it doesn't fit like that, right? Which is fine, which is an acceptable part. Um, So these things are called normative and non-normative influences, right? Normative is an event or something that has an impact uh, which affects everybody in a group, right? That's a normative contextual factor, right? Which affects everybody. So this is basically take coronavirus or COVID-19. That's a normative event, right? It's an event that everybody is going through at the same time and it's impacting people similarly. Whereas non-normative, and then within that there are normative age-graded influences, which is natural and situational influences that are similar for individuals of a specific age range, right? So something that may not affect children and only affects adults, right, would be part of a normative age-graded influence. So let's say what can be a good example of this? Say there is a war that takes place, right? Uh, Children are not going to be in it, right? But most adults will be part of that, right? So it's a situational influence that is going to affect a specific age range. And adults also, older adults will not be there, right? So only early adults will probably be roped in for the war. So that becomes a normative age graded influence. Um, then you have normative history-graded influence, right? These are natural and environmental effects that are related with historical changes which affect the group that exist around the same time. So, for example, if say the tsunami took place, right, it affected a certain group, and it's an environmental effect that had some change in their lives, right? People who were living in the island states and countries. And it's only common for them and not for everybody else, right? Sometimes history graded might be larger, it might be applicable to everybody. So coronavirus is something that will be a normative history graded influence because it affects a huge amount of people and it's going to change how we behave, right? We are not sure yet, but it could be one of those factors that contributes to us changing at some point. So That's that. Then you have non-normative influences. This is something that happens to a single person in their own experience and at a very exceptional period in time when it's not supposed to happen. So these can be positive or negative, right? Anything, you can take anything, getting like your leg fractured or your hand burned or whatever, right? Random stuff that affects only you, and then you react to it in a certain way, and that becomes part of your developmental journey, right?